Ladies and gentlemen, friends and colleagues, thank you all for coming today. It is with a deep sense of loss that we gather here today to remember and celebrate the life of Greg Krumbock, and it's a fitting place to pay tribute. Greg was first elected to Parliament as member of the National Council of Provinces in this building in 1999. Before we begin, I want to extend my deepest condolences to Greg's family, especially his beloved wife Susan, his brother Michael, his father Gerhard, and the rest of the family. I know that no words can ease the sense of pain and loss, but I hope that you take comfort in knowing how loved and respected Greg was by so many. I also want to acknowledge the presence of the DA family, past and present, including Tony Leon, Helen, Zille, and John Steenhuisen, as well as the members of the federal, provincial, and regional leadership from across the country. Thank you all for being here today as we remember Greg's legacy. And to all the guests, friends, and colleagues who have come to pay their respects, welcome. Especially to everyone who's joined us online, thank you. Greg was someone whose impact stretched far and wide, and it's only fitting that we gather here to acknowledge the incredible mark that he left on our party, on our country, and all of us individually. I first heard about Greg Krumbock long before I actually met him. In the mid-2000s, as a young activist, 17 years old when I joined the DA, I heard about the Greg Krumbock method, this almost legendary way of running elections and by-elections. I had no idea who the man behind this method was, but I quickly learned that if you wanted to understand elections, you had to learn the Krumbock method. It wasn't until the late 2000s that I encountered Greg in person, managing by-elections with his characteristic precision and intensity. On by-election day, Greg wasn't just striving for perfection, he demanded it. He had a way of driving results out of everyone around him, whether you were willing or not. With Greg, there was no standing around and chatting. You were part of a finely tuned machine and you knew it. But my first meaningful encounter with Greg came in 2011 when he addressed the DA Ekurhuleni caucus where I was a councillor on the 2011 election outcomes. He brought his characteristic stats, his graphs, his in-depth analysis, and a meticulously prepared PowerPoint, and his insights could only be described as incisive. It was clear to me then that Greg was someone to look up to, someone to learn from, someone to admire, and someone to emulate. From that point on, Greg became not just a mentor, but a friend. Over the years, we exchanged thoughts and ideas on the party, on the electoral landscape, and the general direction of politics in South Africa. After 2015, we both found ourselves increasingly isolated in the party that we both loved, watching with mutual dismay as it drifted away from its liberal roots. But we continued meeting, especially at those federal councils, doing our best with many others in this room today to keep the party on track. And after the difficult 2019 elections, the party went through the right changes, and John Steenhuisen rightly took the decision to restore Greg to his place as the DA's national campaign manager. I was appointed as his deputy, and so what began then was what I can only describe as an apprenticeship that lasted 5 years. Greg would have called it a partnership of equals. He never treated anyone as inferior. But for me, this was a masterclass in politics and operations and in leadership. We worked every day together for these 5 years, across 2 national elections and over 100 by-elections. And I could stand here and tell you everything I learned from Greg, intellectually or operationally. But what I want to focus on is what I learned from him as a leader and a person. As a leader, Greg could be tough, but he was always fair. He treated everyone as an equal, and he truly believed in building teams of equals. He didn't just create colleagues, he built a clan amongst the professional staff and team at DA head office. Under Greg, the professional staff, and myself and others, became a group of people who supported one another, who felt free to express their views, especially to him, and who genuinely liked each other. It's rare to find a leader who can foster that kind of environment, but Greg did. I remember sitting with him late into the night at DA head office, marveling at how so much of a professional staff team would stay long after hours, not because they had to, but because they wanted to. And as a person, Greg was the most principled person I've known. For Greg, it wasn't simply enough to know right from wrong. You had to do what was right. He had a way of cutting through the noise, looking at the facts and the values at hand, and taking a stand, even if it meant taking that stand alone. He wasn't afraid to be a minority of one if it meant upholding his principles. In a world, and especially in politics, where going along to get along is all too common, Greg was a rare breed. His integrity was unwavering, and we could all do well to follow his example. But Greg wasn't all seriousness. He had a mischievous sense of humor that sometimes caught me off guard. I once spoke about an upcoming trip to Germany, and with a wry smile, Greg repeated John Kennedy's faux pas, Ich bin ein Berliner, which means I'm a jelly donut. It should be Ich bin Berliner. I was perplexed and looked at him, and then he chuckled and told me he was born in Berlin. It was a small moment, but it encapsulated that dry wit at the strangest of times that could easily make you smile. So Greg and I worked side by side virtually every day from 2019 through 2 election cycles, and throughout that time, I never once felt like a deputy. I was his friend, and it was a partnership of equals, 2 friends working towards the same goal, trying to rescue South Africa. And now not a day goes by that I don't think of Greg. I sit in meetings in my government role, and I sometimes find myself thinking, this isn't that important, it would be easier to just go along with this. But then I remember Greg, and I raise my hand and I speak up, even if I'm a lone voice, because I know a principle is at stake, and that is what Greg would have expected me to do. I'm very deeply grateful for every moment that I had with Greg, for every one of those late-night, 2-hour-long calls where he just would not end the conversation, for every chat and every meeting. And I know I speak for the entire DA family when I say to Susan, Michael, and the rest of Greg's loved ones, we're very grateful that you shared him with us. His contributions will forever be etched in the history of our party and our country, and his legacy will live on through all of us. Rest in peace, my friend Greg. I will miss you dearly, but never forget you. At this point, can I ask everyone to stand as we sing one of Greg's favorite songs, You'll Never Walk Alone.
And don't be afraid.
At this point, I'd like to call up former DA leader Tony Leon. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Ashor, Susan, family, friends, and colleague of Greg. Walt Whitman, in his epic poem, Song of Myself, wrote, "Do I contradict myself? Very well I contradict myself. I am large, I contain multitudes." Thinking about that, both the largeness of Greg, spiritually, physically, politically, and the many contradictions of his magnificent but complex life, I'm reminded of the fact that Greg was born in West Berlin at the height of the Cold War on the 17th of July 1960, because his parents were on holiday there. Although I also reflect the fact that Germany, or German descendants, has bequeathed this party many politicians, Helen, of course, before her Harry Schwartz, and Greg. So he was born in West Berlin. He grew up in Cape Town. He made his home in what was then Natal, and he landed up representing Mpumalanga in Parliament to begin with. And of course, he supported Liverpool, as you heard from the song. So that's the first contradiction of our dear gallant friend, whom I first met in 1996 in the garage of Penny Tainton. Now, just, at the risk of boring you with a minor background, the province of KwaZulu-Natal had to come and rescue the Western Cape in those far-off days, because it had such a disastrous set of municipal elections here that they were staggered in 1996, that the next and final province was KZN. And I said to the party, this is Stalingrad, either we win this brick by brick, street by street, ward by ward, or game over. And so we all decamped to KZN, but the major focus was on Durban, and my friend and colleague at the time, Vessel Nell, the provincial MP, was in charge of operations in the Midlands. And I said, well, how's it going? Because, I've spent most of my time in Durban. He said, we don't have much of a campaign because there's no money, but we've got a great campaign manager called Greg Krumbock, and that will make the difference, as indeed it did. And so on election day in June 1996 in the Pietermaritzburg city, I met Greg in the garage, as I said, of our candidate Penny Tainton, who, courtesy of his strenuous efforts, won her seat against expectations of that day. So, the second contradiction of Greg is he was that fantastic oxymoron, a passionate accountant. And although Greg's heart let him down at the end, his heart had many chambers. Susan was a big chamber. The cats were another big chamber. And I would have to say politics occupied a very big chamber in Greg's very brave heart. Now, just to prove to you that this is not all made up post-mortem, people have this nauseating habit of inventing things after someone has died to say something good about their life. Well, I'm a true believer in the case of Greg, and in 2008, when I scratched out my voluminous memoir called On the Contrary, this is what I wrote of those times. Now, bear in mind, in 1994, the party, I believe, got 99 seats, well done, in Parliament. We then had 7 in the National Assembly and 3 in the Senate. And we were really hovering between extinction and who knows what. And to get to who knows what, which was in the next election to become the official opposition, we put together a team. This is what I wrote about it in 2008. The party had, by 1998, put in place a professional team to capitalize and capture on this momentum which was starting to emerge, creating a group around me whom I could completely trust with the communication, organization, and policy production that are the necessary staples of modern and effective political movements. These key elements had been largely absent in some of our early amateurish finger-in-the-wind approaches as the results of the 1994 election made evident. And by early 1998, I had found in Greg Krumbock a quietly spoken, immensely intelligent, and passionately political accountant in Pietermaritzburg, someone who could take the reins as party chief executive. He applied number-crunching skills to by-elections with a breathtaking single-mindedness and accuracy that enabled us to marshal our resources on the basis of science rather than sentiment. And so it proved in the 1999 general election. Greg, alongside James Self, Ryan Coetzee, Russell Crystal, and me, took us from the brink of extinction in 1994 to the second largest party in 1999. There are in Greg's story then and over the next 25 years until his untimely and tragic death on the 3rd of September, no shortage of ironies, paradoxes, and some very instructive examples. A few I'd like to share with you this afternoon. The first, as I mentioned, is how does a Murchenbeer, not quite an Italian since he grew up in the Western Cape, but absolutely adopted the Midlands as his home, that's where his heart was. How in his first political office did he become a public representative for Mpumalanga? Well, I'm going to just share with you briefly a story. I know it's completely disappeared from the practice of the party today. And that was the national leadership applied pressure on this province where we expected no seats, we landed up with 2, and Greg had indicated to me, somewhat to my surprise, he wanted to go to Parliament, but the lists had closed. We found there was a vacancy still in Mpumalanga, and with a few incentives, a bit of pressure, quite a lot of money, we persuaded the Mpumalanga province to make Greg Krumbock their unlikely and improbable member of the NCOP. And I hazard just a guess that until that time, Greg did not know very much about the political economy of Nelspruit. But in typical Greg fashion, he set about exploring and understanding the provincial contours of his new home. And then in choosing the portfolio of tourism in Parliament to advance both the provincial interest and his own quiet passion for flora, fauna, ecotourism, and the environment, and also his ability through his financial acumen to go and root out no shortage of scandals then and now in the Department of Tourism. The second, perhaps not quite a paradox, but appropriate to his purposefulness, was how Greg, whose business acumen was a key strength, used this to resolve or rescue the party from looming bankruptcy. And what he did, he devised a scheme, taken over, I might tell you, and perfected by David Maynard, who's sitting there in the fourth row. What he did was he worked out that we would get this model where we would cold canvass small businesses across South Africa and get donations. And, you know, they say, Tony Leon's calling you. Would you take a call from Tony Leon to get the thing? No, most people probably put down the phone at that invitation. And then they would say, okay, and then he'd get through to the CEO, or the call center would, and then they'd give them the spiel. And before it would go cold, what Greg would do in all these provincial centers was send a motor car out. Those were the days of checks, no EFTs, back in the early 2000s. And the driver would go and collect the check from the business in the municipality where the call center located the donor. But it was also Greg in 2001 with his mighty spreadsheets who helped staunch the flow of NNP councillors who were being lured out of the DA into the NNP and got so many of them, the majority, to remain in this party, and which built the foundations of our future success. The other great feature of Greg's political purpose and passion was how, as Ashore so brilliantly presented today, virtually generations of future voting district managers, constituency heads, and campaign managers in the arts and science of electioneering and vote winning. So much so, as has been mentioned, that in choosing a campaign manager for this pivotal May 2024 general election, the party leadership again chose Greg to run the campaign. 25 years and 6 elections after his debut national campaign leadership back in 1999. Now, that's the macro, but Greg, as always, a very obsessive fixator, also focused on the micro. And he used to bore me year in and year out, we just need 5,000 votes and we're going to win Umgeni, Howick. And I say, yeah, we need to carry on. And, there we go, and win Howick Umgeni, his passion political project. And that is why Chris Pappas today is an effective municipal mayor of ground that was won and created by Gregory R. Krumbock. And so we come to perhaps the saddest irony of all, or two of them. Greg, for all his warrior-like brave-heartedness, did not have a good physical heart. And so the one did not match the other. And in fact, the last direct communication I had from Greg before he got too sick and Susan took over the comms was on the 20th of June, when he wrote to me a very appreciative WhatsApp about the tribute which I was paying that day to James Silf at his memorial service that day. And so, by dint of cruel irony, here we gather, barely 3 months later, to pay tribute to another great soldier of our cause and one of the key founders of the modern Democratic Alliance. However, I do need to share with you my previous WhatsApp with him, which were entirely typical. I was in Johannesburg in the middle of May this year, and I messaged Greg, as I often did, to complain about the lack of DA posters in Glen Hazel and Edenvale. He called me back at length to explain the essence of the problem. He was sitting in the Vintage restaurant down the road on his own, naturally, because he's working quite late in the night, and he assured me it would be rectified. 2 days later, on my return trip to Joburg Airport, I travelled through Glen Hazel and Edenvale and found out it had been as per expectation. A man in matters large and small, always as good as his word. Now, there is always, on sad and celebratory occasions such as today, where we mourn a great loss, but we celebrate such a well-lived life, to gloss over our dear friend's fallibilities. So let me just say this. Greg, who had such a zeal and level of competence, almost sans parallel, did not always appreciate others who were not made of the same stuff. I told him once, you do never account for what Isaiah Berlin called the crooked timber of humanity, in which, unfortunately, so many of his colleagues and contemporaries were built from. But he always gave his all, and he had little time or truck for those who did not. Finally, although Greg lived to see the DA enter the portals of power, as that magnificent photograph of him standing outside the Union buildings earlier this year attests, he did not live to see his beloved party make a success, a failure, or something in between of the government of national unity. And here we are, 100 plus days. So we don't know what Greg would say going forward. But if I can presumptuously make 2 suggestions about what he might do, think, or suggest, here they are. As you know, Greg was immensely well read across a range of subjects, disciplines, and genres. But I don't know if Greg ever read Typhoon by Joseph Conrad. But I do know with absolute certainty that he would approve of the opening lines of that book and suggest they would be a very good manual for the DA in government. Captain McWhirr said, facing it, always facing it. That's the way to go through, face it. We also know that Greg's governing passion was a commitment to liberalism. His detractors once described him as leader of the liberal Taliban in the DA, which did occur to me as being a lot better than the other Taliban. So to honor him, his life and his cause, we owe in our future gratitude, a reminder that at all times we should advance liberal principles. That is the key to success in government going forward. Now, Walt Whitman, with whom I commenced this address, gave me a very good line on which to close it. The past and present wilt, I have filled them all. Farewell, dear friend.
Thank you very much, Tony, for that very kind tribute. And I think we all owe you a great deal of gratitude in the DA for identifying this obsessive accountant and making him the campaign manager whom we've leaned on for 25 years. Our next speaker is Helen Zille. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Ashore. As you probably all know, I usually speak off the cuff, but today I really wanted to get it right, so I wrote down a few words. Susan, Michael and Greg's extended family, and his many colleagues and friends. Thank you for the honor of asking me to say a few words on a day which none of us expected to arrive so prematurely, just when Greg was on the threshold of his new life. The haunting Gabriel's oboe that we heard, the theme tune from the mission, was perfectly chosen because Greg, like the Jesuit priest Gabriel in the movie, was a man with a mission. Greg's life had a purpose, which he turned into impact, and then he turned impact into legacy. It cannot be said of many people that their lives changed the trajectory of their country. Greg's life was one that did. Greg told us that the 2024 election was going to be his last hurrah, after 50 years of active service to the cause that fueled his short 64-year lifespan. 50 of those years were spent campaigning for our party and its predecessors. The next chapter was going to be devoted to his other great passion, Susan and Kwawula, doing the things that all politicians promise their families they will one day get around to. It is a small consolation that he had achieved his lifelong professional ambition of seeing the DA becoming a party of government at national level. He had given everything to that campaign and then some, despite his failing heart, until the cruel finger of fate, if that is what you can call a treatment-resistant infection, finally struck the fatal blow. Guilt is a wasted emotion, but a surge of self-blame pulsed through many of us for not having forced Greg to take time off from making SA a better place to making himself better. When I confessed this to Susan, seeking some atonement, she comforted me by saying he probably wouldn't have listened anyway. And that did make me feel a bit better, Susan. I got to know Greg during his first major national campaign, the one that Tony alluded to 25 years ago. It was a great privilege to be able to work with him then, and again much more closely during his final crusade. In 1999, it was a much younger Greg, and he was a real dish. You must see some of the photos later. In 1999, it was a much younger Greg, Tony, and Ryan Kutsia who formed the intrepid triumvirate that conceptualized and led a campaign that has become the stuff of electoral legend. The Fight Back election laid the foundation for every subsequent success of the DA. And Tony has well described Greg's crucial innovations that made it happen. He honed those techniques in every subsequent election. The only election since the dawn of democracy in which we went backwards was the one in which Greg did not play a leading role, and that was no coincidence. 1999 was my first campaign as a candidate. I'd been involved in many campaigns before, since I was also something like 17 years old. But 1999 was my first year as a candidate, so anybody who hasn't made it through an electoral college or whatever, remember how long it has taken some of us. And it was by far our party's most controversial campaign. Hate rained on us from every quarter because of those two monosyllabic words, fight back. If anyone today feels the waves of flack, they should just be grateful that a few pioneers were willing to face the tsunami back then. And I can't claim to have been one of them. Greg enjoyed recalling how I spent a lot of my time wasting his time, telling him what a disaster the campaign was and that the result would be career-ending. Greg remained unflappable. Of course, I had no idea that in the background he was pioneering this thing called the tracking pole. And for some reason, he had greater faith in what it was telling him than what I was. It enabled him to filter out the key electoral signals from the cacophonous background noise. And so it was that tracking pole entered our vocabulary to dominate every subsequent election. When future generations of activists routinely use words like squeeze, fluff, worm, macho canvassing, and sweep four, let them know who the neologist was behind those words, as well as the innovator of the activities they describe. Not many people leave colloquial language as part of their legacy, but Greg did. And none of us will ever be able to drive past the first posters of a campaign again without checking whether we can read them at 80 kilometers per hour. But Greg was so much more than his work. His legendary will to win was genetic. Few know that Greg won his first major contest when he was a few months old by being voted the cutest baby in a fiercely contested competition aboard the ocean liner that was bringing his parents and their firstborn baby son to South Africa. But as you got to know him, you soon learnt that winning was not Greg's highest value. Integrity was. That is the best and rarest reason to enter politics. Greg saw the world in black and white, right and wrong, and the line between them was deeply embedded in his consciousness. It fascinated me that a man with this defining quality would choose to spend his working life in politics, which operates mainly in the grey. Yet it is precisely for this reason that Greg and others who share this rare attribute are so indispensable to our project. They know where the line is when many don't even see it. They don't hesitate to tell you when you are crossing it, and they remind you that the end does not justify the means. As I was learning more about Greg, the private person, from Susan, I realized that we at FHO had only scratched the surface of this complex, multi-dimensional man. Susan told me exactly what Tony has been saying now, because she said, and I quote, "From the time that I first met Greg when we were both students at UCT, he appeared to be a contradiction." And of course, we all know that this is true. Greg was the intensely private person who took on big battles in the public square. He never cared much about appearances, preferring substance over style. Yet he succumbed graciously to the inevitable when Liana sent Janine to make sure Greg looked presentable for his television and stage appearances during congresses and elections. And he relished the attention of Nabila, also dispatched by Liana, to ensure that Greg ate a healthy salad every lunchtime. Greg the Stoic really enjoyed being pampered. He did not care much for worldly goods, but invested greatly in creating with Susan a magnificent wildlife sanctuary that I have only seen through Susan's impeccable photography, and a magnificent indigenous garden. For all the years we knew him, he schlepped his stuff around in an enormous old leather tog bag, sagging under the weight of documents and other possessions that accompanied him on his migrant lifestyle. So many of us tried and failed for years to get him to buy a modern suitcase with wheels. He would not spend money on himself, but when it came to buying a camera for Susan, only the best would do. He was the statistically brilliant cerebral number cruncher who worked with cold facts, but defrosted in a warm kind of glow if football or felines entered the conversation. I made the massive mistake of once telling Greg, when he was teaching his by-election course, it couldn't have been a worst possible time, that I wasn't a cat person. I am sure that cost me a good few marks, and that Greg looked at me a bit warily ever since that day. He loved reading about ancient Greece because, he said, that civilization pioneered democracy long before the birth of Christ. And Rome, because of the sheer longevity and scale of its empire, engineered in large measure by the attributes of leadership, which fascinated him. He said that that reading gave him his foundational knowledge of politics, still relevant today. Yet this lover of ancient history found equal fascination in traveling thousands of years into a fictitious future by watching and rewatching every episode of every season of Star Trek. I thought it appropriate in paying homage to Greg to try and understand what he saw in this series that I had never watched. Susan told me that season 4, episode 23 was his favorite. I found it on Netflix with some assistance from one of my sons, and soon realized that I am not the target audience. But I persevered in honor of Greg, and I then phoned Ashwell to ask him to explain what it meant. Ashwell, Greg's closest election partner and successor as campaign manager, had been required to watch this episode repeatedly because Greg said that it reminded us why we do what we do. I'm afraid that meeting had eluded me until Ashwell informed me gently that I had watched the wrong season 4, episode 23. I should have watched Star Trek Voyager, season 4, episode 23, which is set 2,000 years in the future, looking back at events 1,000 years from now, exploring the relationship between the past and present, and warning against the risk of historical relativism and the importance of the present. That's why I had to read it. I took Ashwell's word for it, and at least I hope that Greg knows I tried. Still puzzled, though, I did what one does, and I Googled, are there any cats in Star Trek? And to my amazement, up it popped. Did you know that there are no fewer than 7 favorite cats in Star Trek? And that made sense to me. In 2010, when we hosted the Football World Cup, Greg had the good fortune of being our shadow minister of sport. What a good place to be at the right time. It therefore made sense that Zakumi, the leopard cat, was the event's mascot. There was Greg, this formidable intellect, with a stuffed Zakumi toy on his desk. It made him less intimidating and wholly endearing. Few people know that Greg actually entered politics through football, and of course you never dared to call it soccer when Greg was around. When he was at school at SACS, South African College Schools in Newlands, they only offered rugby. So Greg did what Greg does and launched a campaign for the introduction of football. It failed, but he was better prepared for the next battle, which began when, aged 18, Greg joined the Wynberg Soccer Club. That was their name. I'm surprised that Greg didn't campaign to change it, but they did call themselves the Soccer Club. Almost immediately, Greg and a friend called Tony, not Leon, but another Tony, launched a campaign to open the club to all races. Being Greg, he would have done it because it was the right thing to do, but I know it would not have escaped him that the move would also significantly improve the club's chances of winning. What Greg would call a win-win. Another cat that Greg adored was the stuffed tiger, Hobbes, from Bill Watterson's immortal comic strip, Calvin and Hobbes. For many people, it is the best comic strip ever created for its capacity to deal with deep issues in a whimsical way and poke holes through pretense and pomposity. In the strip that made me think of Greg this week, Calvin and his pet tiger Hobbes are walking along a pavement made from square slabs. Suddenly, Calvin stops in the middle of a slab and says to Hobbes, "Let's say life is this square of the sidewalk. You're born at this crack, and we die at that crack. Now we find ourselves somewhere inside the square, and in the process of walking out of it, suddenly we realize our time here is fleeting. Is our quick experience here pointless? Does anything we say and do here really matter? Have we done anything important? Have we been happy? Have we made the most of these precious few footsteps?" Now, these questions overwhelm both Calvin and Hobbes, and in the last frame, as night falls, they stand under a sickle moon, caught in philosophical bewilderment, eyes fixed to their feet in the middle of their small square of life. We all know that famous poem, The Dash, by Linda Ellis, in which a person's life is encapsulated by that punctuation mark that separates the date of their birth from the date of their death. And in Greg's case, it is 1960-2024. The two most famous lines in Linda's poem say, "For it matters not how much we own, the cars, the house, the cash. What matters is how we live and love and how we spend our dash." And so, in summarizing the significance of Greg's dash, I can do no better than quote Barack Obama at the funeral of the pioneering civil rights campaigner, Senator John Lewis. What Obama said then could just as comfortably be said about Greg today. Quote, that he spent his life in service of an idea. The idea that any of us ordinary people, without rank or wealth or title or fame, can somehow point out the imperfections of our nation and come together and challenge the status quo and decide that it is in our power to remake the country that we love until it more closely aligns with our highest ideals. That is really the revolutionary idea of our time, in this era of fake revolutionaries. And in the real revolution, Greg Krumbock was a standard bearer. Thank you.
I think that if Greg were here right now, he'd take it as a feather in his cap that he got Helen to watch a Star Trek episode, or two, as it were. Our next speaker is current DA leader John Steenhuisen. John.
Good afternoon to, first of all, Greg's family and friends, to the DA family, and to all of those watching online. We gather here today in Parliament to celebrate the life of Greg Krumbock. But we also use the day to say our final farewells to somebody who has been such an integral part of the life of our party, but also the life of our country. Where does one even begin in trying to pay tribute to somebody like Greg Krumbock? Somebody who strode the political stage, who redefined the way in which political campaigns in our country are run, designed, and executed. Several words came to mind when I was working on my remarks for today. Loyal, steadfast, principled, reliable, driven, passionate, and consistent. And all of these words describe our good friend and fighting campaigner, Greg Krumbock, incredibly well. The problem about speaking last is that you get to have to cut out some of the anecdotes that you had in your speech, because Tony and Ashore and Helen have so beautifully traversed so many of them. But I did have it written down here that Greg was not one for the latest fashion, affliction, or fad. Greg was the same person every day. And I've been privileged to know Greg for my entire political career, starting out as a young activist in KwaZulu-Natal, where Greg was already somewhat of a legend. And I remember walking into a meeting in Pietermaritzburg in some dreadful office we had in some back alley in Mzanduzi. Penny's laughing because she remembers it well. I don't think there was any natural light in that office. And seeing this rather strange-looking chap with a very bad haircut and a very disheveled shirt, and saying, "Is this really Greg Krumbock, the legendary Greg Krumbock?" And indeed it was. I think Greg really enjoyed election time as well, because it made his fashion choices much easier. He could just pull on a DA golf shirt, which he loved to wear so dearly. And never one for spending money on himself, and he lived a humble life that belied his means. And he did so, I believe, because inside he was a humble person and a true servant leader. He was very proud of the successions of Toyota Corollas that he loved to drive. And I remember going into that office and having a clipboard thrust into my hand and a name tag put onto my lapel that identified me as an agent for Rupa Sash Surveys. And Rupa Sash Surveys was the genesis of our polling and canvassing operation in South Africa. Of course, Rupa Sash, I said to him, it's a bit of an odd name. Greg, he said, yes, it's named after the cats, Rupert and Sasha. So even the cats made it in there. And I know that Una and others used to walk the streets of whatever area we were having a by-election and do our cold calling on the behalf of Rupa Sash Surveys, but we'd be taking all of the information back to that dingy office in Pietermaritzburg, where Greg would earnestly punch the numbers into his computer there and be able to spit out the results. Tony and Helen have already traversed Greg's enormous role in the 1999 election. And I can safely say, without a shadow of a doubt, that it wasn't for Greg and the team that Tony talks about in his book at that time, we would not be a party today. There would be no DA. The DP would not have survived. And the important role that we have played in entrenching democracy, respect for the rule of law, ensuring our values are represented in South Africa, would have wasted away on the sidelines. But it was Greg's determination, his iron will, and his absolutely unfaltering work ethic that got us over the line in 1999. And it would be easy for one to sit back then and say, well, I've done something great, now I'll sit back on my laurels and bask in the glory of this great election. But Greg's next step was to go out there and reinvent the way in which the DA contested by-elections around the country. And we've all been on the courses. They were compulsory for public representatives. But Greg's been running these by-election courses for the last 15 to 20 years. I remember we wrote the first exam, Susan, at Kwaula in the hall, and it was catered for by one of Greg's friends on the estate. And that's where the words of target worms, scratcher, a hopper, and a zone controller came to be known. And these today form the bedrock of our by-election successes. And one of my greatest regrets is that Greg didn't live to see the North Korean-style results we've received in the last 3 months of by-elections around the country, where his method is still used exactly as he set out. And it was his passion for sharing this knowledge with others that set Greg out. In an environment where special knowledge or some edge is a closely guarded resource that you keep to separate yourself and distinguish yourself from your competitors and peers, that wasn't Greg's way. Greg loved to share his knowledge. Once he got you in a corner, he could share it for quite a long time, as I'm sure many of you have experienced. But nonetheless, that developed into this by-election course. And it was his absolute commitment to making sure that these things were documented in manuals, that the recipe for Greg's magic mix, the glue that keeps our posters on the polls, remains with us today. 2019 and the few years ahead of that were a tough time for Greg. And in chatting to him over a few discussions, it was a very difficult time for him. Someone having been so absolutely intrinsically connected with the strategy and the lifeblood of the party, to find himself on the periphery was incredibly hard for him. And he weathered those frustrations. And I've no doubt that if Greg Krumbock had been leading us in the 2019 campaign, it would not have been the reversal that so many of us were so disappointed to have to go through. He wouldn't have let it happen. And so when I got elected as the leader of the party in 2019, and I think we forget in the flush of victory and celebration of just how difficult those days were, and our party had slipped down to 16% in the polls. Many people had proclaimed the death of the DA. That when I got elected, the first thing Tony Leon said to me was, phone Greg Krumbock, you need him to run your next national campaign. And I duly did that. And I'll never forget, I phoned Greg from my kitchen. And I said to him, Greg, we need you. Now, somebody who had been pushed out in the way that Greg had onto the periphery, a lesser man would have been bitter and angry and would have probably, pushed back and said, well, no ways. He said to me, I will do it, but I have to speak to Susan first. So I can't give you an answer today, I'll speak to you tomorrow. But I knew that whatever Susan said, I knew that she would let him come and do what he wanted to do and what he did best, which was run elections. And so he came to be the campaign manager for the 2021 election, and again proved his mettle and proved his love for country and party and his absolute discipline and will to win ensured that we exited that 2021 election in far better shape than we were when we went into it. And I'll never forget, I gave Greg in the opening days of that campaign a hat, a cap. Some of you may have seen it. Because Greg loved history. And he loved a historical story, and he loved a historical parallel with the modern event. And I spent many times in his office, which I would probably best describe as a labyrinth of papers that would make the maze runner nervous about trying to make your way from one side of the office to the other. But the amazing thing is, as I'm sure Delisha and Una will tell you, that in all of that chaos and those huge piles of paper, Greg knew exactly where every document he needed was. And Una and Delisha recounted to me numerous calls in odd hours of the morning or night where Greg would phone the office and say, I need the document and it's in pile 7, about a 3/4 of the way down, in the red folder. And Una and Delisha would duly go there, and there they would find the document that Greg needed in that labyrinth. But he loved history. And so I gave him a cap, and a cap had a slogan on it. It said, "Don't give up the ship." And it's got a great parallel because it was the dying command of the captain of the USS Chesapeake in 1813 to his crew, "Don't give up the ship." And I said to Greg, "We've got to save the DA, we've got to get this party back on track, and we can't give up the ship." And he wore the cap with great pride, and I hope it's still somewhere around, Susan, to remember him by. But I remember him coming to me very proudly after that election result, and he said, "Captain, I didn't give up the ship." And he certainly didn't. But that election was also a huge boost for Greg, because finally, after telling Tony and Helen and successive leaders for years and years that we were going to win the Umgeni municipality and we just needed X number of votes, as Tony said, we finally won it. And it was a source of immense pride for Greg to see that dream that he had worked so doggedly and dedicated towards coming to pass. And Mayor Papas and the team there have a huge task of living up now to Greg's dream for the Umgeni municipality. And then it made absolute sense that when 2024 rolled around, that we went back to Greg and said, "Greg, we would like you to run the campaign." And he said, "I'm happy to do it and I would love to do it, but I'm telling you it's going to be my last campaign, and so I want you to give me a couple of people who can sit around with me and learn what needs to be done." And Ashaw and the rest of the team in the office fulfilled that role. I do feel guilty and selfish in a way, because we could see Greg's health was fading. And there were meetings where Greg had to sit down. There were meetings when it became very obvious that his health was failing. And lesser men would have called it quits, handed it over to somebody else. But Greg was determined to see this election through. It was that sense of loyalty, that sense of service, that work ethic that just kept pushing him, and pushing him. And that's what eventually, I believe, drove him to the situation where eventually that big heart, so full of love and so full of compassion and so full of commitment, ultimately failed him. And so our duty now is to live up to Greg's standards. And those of you who knew Greg know that he had incredibly high standards. Helen has already said, Greg is somebody who does not operate in the grey. Life for Greg was black and white. And having grown up in KZN and spending my politics in KZN, we sometimes find ourselves on different sides of some of the, what now look back, were petty and silly arguments about KZN politics. But in all of those, I never lost respect for Greg and never doubted for a minute his integrity and his commitment to the cause. And one of his greatest quotes, when speaking to him about, Greg, can't you just let this go? Why do you have to keep, pushing this? Can't you just, let something go? He used to quote to me that great quote from Grantland Rice that said, and I quote, "For when the one great scorer comes to mark against your name, he writes not that you won or lost, but how you played the game." And Greg played the game with a straight bat every single day of his life and did not waver once. It was also wonderful to chat to Greg about the variety of interests that he had. And he could keep you quite late into the night, although I did learn the trick in the end, that if you want to actually deal with Greg and those late night calls, to phone him back at 6 a.m. the next morning. Because I knew for a minute that Greg didn't start working till a bit later in the day. But we'd talk about Roman history, we'd talk about Star Wars, we'd talk about World War II, which was also another area of great passion of his. And of course, Liverpool Football Club, which Greg loved. And he lived a life that was full and rich. Marcus Aurelius was somebody who also Greg loved to read about and quote from time to time, the Roman emperor. And I thought it fitting to share one of the quotes of Marcus Aurelius today, and I quote, "It is not death that a man should fear, but he should fear never beginning to live." Well, Greg never had that problem, because Greg lived, and he lived large. And he lived a life of purpose, not of idle pleasure, not of self-indulgent. He lived a life of purpose, and he lived a life of consequence. And our country, our party, and I dare say ourselves, are better off today because of it. And so we today say farewell to this fighting campaigner. And although he's gone, he still lives on with us all. We will, if we listen carefully enough, hear his footsteps in the late night in the halls of the Marx building. He will live on in the lessons of Star Wars that lie in those episodes. We will hear him, if we listen closely enough, in the cheering at a Liverpool game. We will see him in the wisdom of a Calvin and Hobbes cartoon strip. We will see him and feel him in the beauty of the morning mist that breaks so beautifully over his beloved Kwaula. And at every by-election victory cry, he will be there. The greatest tribute we can pay to Greg, the greatest way we can match his legacy, and the greatest way we can pay tribute to his enormous role and contribution to our party is to each of us in politics live a life of purpose and live a life of consequence. And most importantly, don't give up the ship. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, John. And I know that John and I are both going to miss every time a new Tom Holland book comes out. Tom Holland is a historian of the Roman Empire. Greg telling us incessantly that we need to go and get that book and read it, and exactly why. And as avid readers, all three of us, those are one of the things we will have to keep doing in his honor, John, is going to exclusive books and getting the new Tom Holland novel. At this point, before I ask everyone to stand to sing, there's an anecdote as to why the song was chosen. Greg and Liana, scouting for the venue for our closing rally, they were discussing what song are we going to play at the closing rally. And this was the one that he wanted. It was The Crossing, O Caesar, by Johnny Clegg. So if everyone can please stand to sing that.
Good afternoon, all. What has been predominantly spoken about today is Greg's significant impact in the big domain of South African politics. His achievements were considerable. But what may have surprised him was how so very many people from all walks of life have, since his passing, shared stories of how he helped them personally, of the positive influence he had on their lives and the high regard they had for him. In his political role, Greg most enjoyed his constituency work, and so in drawing on just one such message, I will quote a constituent in Moyamgeni, an entrepreneur who started off with a roadside farm stall and gradually grew his business into the prime tourist attraction on the Meander. He felt his success threatened with the cost of doing business under ANC governance. This altered with the DA winning Umgeni, when an incredible tsunami of positivity swept through the Midlands, and which was further buoyed by the recent gains on a national scale. On learning of Greg's passing, he had this to say: Greg changed the lives of thousands of people and will be part of the new South Africa. We are eternally grateful for who he was and what he did for all of us. His legacy will be with us forever. He has given us hope again. I am very privileged to have known him. Tony, it was you who brought Greg into the formal structures of the now DA, and you who therefore allowed him the arena he needed to fulfill his ambitions. Before he became ill, Greg told me that he had accomplished all that he wished to achieve in politics. He had you to thank for giving him the impetus. You could not have given him a greater gift. Helen, your unshakable values and strength in holding the line have at times put you at risk of experiencing the cold isolation of the moral high ground. But this, together with your work ethic, is what Greg so admired about you. He regarded you as a remarkable person, and this has lent weight to the words that you have spoken today. John, Greg's ship has now sunk, but the voyage must continue. Greg said of himself that he was DA because he was Greg, not Greg because he was DA. The DA espoused the values he held dear, and he gave his all for what he believed in. Let it be so, that the DA stands firm with this belief system, and that today's opportunities, which he helped to create, are used to further the trajectory of what is good in our country. Asher, Greg was in awe of your brilliance and competency. I know that he felt he had left his work in safe hands when handing the baton over to you. I hope that you'll continue to lend your strength to the DA for many years to come. Thank you, Liana, and your team for putting this tribute together. Greg had the utmost respect for you all, and his belief in you is evidenced today in your superb organization, where every detail has been put together with Greg in mind to honor him respectfully. Greg, always so immersed in his work, regarded the DA as his other family. He appreciated your expertise and enjoyed your camaraderie throughout the years. and it was your love and support which surrounded Greg and myself in his last few months that helped us on this difficult road. To my brothers, Jeffrey and Peter, who have supported me around the clock every single day from London and Hong Kong, to Ulf and Nigel, who have been on the ground with me, to Greg's boyhood friends, Tony, Alan and Andre, and to all of our neighbours and friends, thank you for travelling this journey with us and allowing us to lean into your strength. To Greg's father, brother and family, I am so sorry for your sadness at this immense loss. Having shared your own life's journey with him, it is an extremely difficult time for you. To Greg, it has been said that great grief is born of great love. Indeed, I love you greatly. I miss you. You took my world with you. But I thank you for sharing your life with me. It was a wonderful journey, and one that I would not have lived differently. Rest gently.
I think at this point I'd like to ask everyone to please stand for the singing of the national anthem.
skies of green, red roses too. I see them bloom for me and you, and I think to myself, what a wonderful world. I see skies of blue and clouds of white, the bright blessed day, the dark sacred night, and I think to myself, what a wonderful world. The colors of the rainbow, so pretty in the sky, are also on the faces of people going by. I see friends shaking hands, saying, how do you do? They're really saying, I love you. I hear babies cry, I watch them grow. They'll learn much more than I never knew. And I think to myself, what a wonderful world. Yes, I think to myself, what a wonderful world.
I'm actually a little bit overcome with emotion, but really the privilege is all mine to work with this team and our wonderful Democrats around the country. What a journey it's been, and let's hope it has a very, very happy ending. So much good work has been done. So many massive crowds have attended our events. The vibe out there in the country has been nothing short of spectacular. I know we're going to solidify this victory, and therefore I want to thank every one of you. I'm very, very appreciative of it, but most of all, colleagues, to have walked this road for nearly 50 years. This is my 49th year in the party, and to achieve what we have achieved, it's nothing short of miraculous. So thank you very, very much. It's been an absolute honor to build a country. I admire every one of you for playing a role in doing that. As John Steenhuisen once said to us, we are doing God's work. So that, I think, is the best possible tribute we could get. And God bless. Goodbye, everyone. I'm actually a little bit overcome with emotion, but really the privilege is all mine to work with this team and our wonderful Democrats around the country. What a journey it's been, and let's hope it has a very, very happy ending. So much good work has been done. So many massive crowds have attended our events. the vibe out there in the country has been nothing short of spectacular. I know we're going to solidify this victory, and therefore I want to thank every one of you. I'm very, very appreciative of it, but most of all, colleagues, to have walked this road for nearly 50 years. This is my 49th year in the party, and to achieve what we have achieved, it's nothing short of miraculous. So thank you very, very much. It's been an absolute honor to build a country. I admire every one of you for playing a role in doing that. As John Steenhuisen once said to us, we are doing God's work. So that, I think, is the best possible tribute we could get, and God bless. Goodbye, everyone.
I'd just like to take a moment to thank everyone for attending today's memorial of Greg. And we do have snacks at the end outside in the Queen's Gallery. I hope that you take the time to reminisce with each other about everything that Greg meant to so many of us. Thank you very much.